Okay, guys, welcome to week 4. We are looking at institutional critique today, specifically through two articles from Andrea Fraser. I am going to try to keep this very short and sweet because I know I've given you some long lecture material as of recently, so wish me luck on keeping it short. We are investigating sort of the development of institutional critique and how we see it playing out sort of in museum culture, in performance, in activism, in protest, etc. So as a larger part of understanding some of the core concepts of this class, institutional critique is very important and valuable. So what, in God's name, is institutional critique? So the origins of institutional critique really come from the 1960s with performance art, land art, conceptual and process art. So again, like 2 weeks ago, we were talking about performance and performance artists as well, that we're contemplating this very particular time period. And institutional critique sort of starts here with some of these artists we're going to talk about today, like Hans Hack and Daniel Buren, and then we're going to move on to thinking about Andrea Fraser as an artist as well. So again, rethinking the art object, and then I have those artists listed here as well. So institutional critique is art that exposes the structure and logic of museums and art galleries, and it engages sites, above all social sites, structured sets of relations that are fundamentally social relations. So, Andrea Fraser talks about critically reflexive site specificity, which I know is an incredible mouthful, and is actually kind of complicated in how she defines it, but I think it's kind of sort of very clear why she uses this term. So I'll sort of build it for you here so that hopefully you'll gain some clarity about it. So when she talks about this critical reflexive site specificity, she talks about it a lot in a lot of her different interviews and lectures and her artwork, and why that this whole term as a total is important. So while you can think about reflexive but not be critical, well, even site-specific critique is not necessarily reflexive, but the basic premise of institutional critique, as I understand it, is that you can't change something over there, you can only change what is present in the here and now of your engagement with it. Also has to do with it's important to be specific about what we mean by change. Things are changing all the time, but most change is just a means of reproducing existing social structures. So a critique of what exactly and to what end? We've mostly rejected modernist aestheticism, art for art's sake, and we've replaced it with what I sometimes call avant-garde transgressivism, transgression for transgression's sake, critique for critique's sake, change for change's sakes. That's what I hear from the entrepreneurial world. Change, change, change. Does that mean progress? Does it mean making the world better for everyone, or just maintaining or improving our own position? What are we talking about? And what really kind of shocks me is, or not shocks me, but I find really profound about what she's saying is that you can say that things are changing, but are they continuing to reproduce existing social structures? Are we really changing as an art world? Or are we just continuing to sort of quote unquote progress within the sort of confines of social structures that are built around art and institutions of museums? And I do like this little quote that I kept at the bottom here, which is, I once asked Hans Hack, how did you start doing political work? He said, I was pissed off, which is the basis for a lot of his work, I would say. So when she talks about critically reflexive site specificity, it's different from other activism that works on conditions or relations removed from the primary field of the practice itself. If you want to change something, a relation, particularly a relation of power, the best, if not only way to accomplish such change is by intervening in the enactment of that relation. So, to the extent that a site is understood as a set of relations, institutional critique aims to transform not only the substantive, visible manifestations of those relations, but their structure, particularly what is hierarchical in that structure, and the forms of power and domination, symbolic and material violence produced by those hierarchies. So, what in God's name does any of that mean? Well, like many other radical practices of the 1960s, institutional critique emerged with the realization by artists that all artworks, no matter how aesthetically autonomous, can be exploited for economic and symbolic profit, and often not in spite of, but because of their autonomy, an autonomy that determines their existence not only as objects or ideas, but as material or even immaterial commodities. So, like land art, like performance art, these artists felt manipulated and commodified by the artistic community, and by a system of selling and buying, where pieces of inspiration and ideas are just sold off as commodities, right? And what do you do with that? How do you change the way you perceive your art? Does your art then become purely an object of commodity, and then does it lose sort of the value you've put into it as an artist, etc.? You can ask so many questions, I think. So there are so many artists kind of working in many ways sort of in the streets in the 1960s that are very much part of the institutional critique movement later on, like Village, again, my French is horrific, but he is using subway posters and ripping them apart, and cutting them and recreating objects. So a lot of their work, this is sort of in the New Realism section, which also includes Daniel Buren, who I'm going to show next, Buren, that this is sort of art that wasn't early sort of commodified, but the minute that these artists were to become popular and influential, their art becomes sort of a part of institutional dialogue and purchasing, right? So Daniel Buren does these sort of like little poster critiques where he uses line work and posters them all over the subways, as sort of a critique of art and art space, right? People, they have no connection to these lines, they don't know why they're there, and thus sort of Buren is able kind of sort of bypass the institution for a time. Kind of this way of cultural jamming that can kind of resist some of these institutionalizations of and productization, I don't know, advertising, and sort of resist being part of the museum culture as a whole. Now, she continues to talk about this term. I should really have like a CRSS or something. This is what makes institutional critique, like psychoanalysis, so profoundly difficult, because to intervene in relations in their enactment also always means as you yourself participate in their enactment, however self-consciously. Some issue with trying to change something while also enacting it as part of the critique. So how can you critique an institution without already being part of that institution, right? How can you make art and then never sell it? Will you rot off financially as an artist? If you want to change something, a relation, particularly a relation of power, the best, if not only way to accomplish such change is by intervening in the enactment of that relation. And this is really where we start to get to kind of this core idea of not only are artists sort of inherently trying to kind of escape the museum system in some capacity, but what they also start to realize as they produce art, and then that art is commodified, that really, at the core, we are the institution of art. The objects of our critiques, our attacks, is always also inside ourselves. It exists as an enactment of the splitting that produced the institution of art as we know it, the splitting of the field of culture between specialized and vernacular production and consumption, without which relatively autonomous art would not exist. And this was because of self-critique and historical avant-gardes. So we are part of the institution. The institution is within us. We are sort of inherently part of this system as a whole, because we as sort of museum goers, as purchasers of art, as studiers of art, we are already part of the institution. And so can you really enact art outside of it, right? Is that really realistic if you are making art and critiquing something that you are sort of very much a part of at large? So when she's talking about this critically reflexive site specificity, remember that that is also a part of, not only are you trying to critique an institution like a museum, maybe you're trying to critique some other kind of institution like the police force or the government. You are still a part of that. You are not separate from it. And it's your decision and how you want to sort of change the way that maybe art is perceived, the way that art is perceived. You have to know that all of those sort of constructs and ideas are also inside you. You are also part of that system. She continues this a lot with her next article, which is From the Critique of Institutions to an Institution of Critique, which is a mouthful. But she talks about institutional critique becoming institutionalized. And this really has to do with kind of museums picking up this idea, throwing conferences, right? We're going to have a conference about institutional critique, and we're going to bring in all these artists who are critiquing us right on our walls. Isn't that so cool? Trying to be hip and interesting, and oh, we're so revolutionary because we're bringing in these artists to our museum, right? In the context of museum exhibitions and art history conferences such as these, one increasingly finds institutional critique accorded the unquestioning respect often granted artistic phenomena that have achieved a certain historical status. So she starts to talk about some of these famous artists that have tried to sort of deal with and contemplate institutional critique at large. And Daniel Byrne is an example, and we're going to kind of come back to how this work relates to that. But she kind of criticizes Byrne here, and then she sort of, I would say she kind of rewinds, because she's making a very important part, or a very important argument with Byrne's work. But this work in particular, painting sculpture, was exhibited in the Guggenheim in the 1970s, and no one ever got to see it because this work was so large and took up such a large portion of the interior of the Guggenheim. Donald Judd and Dan Flavin asked for this work to be taken down because they believed it was blocking their own work. And so the Guggenheim said yes and did that. And Fraser's kind of critiquing him a little bit because he goes back in 2005 and kind of reenacts this in a different way by creating Eye of the Storm from 2005, in which he places this reflective piece in the center of the Guggenheim, where it's meant to reflect space and images and light. And so it kind of gives this really weird optical illusion of this space. So maybe in an attempt to make something that's not blocking the ramps, but I think he's very much sort of critiquing the museum as a whole and sort of what they support and think about. And then I'm going to come back to him and what she says about him later in her article as well, the second article. Fraser also realizes sort of some of the contradictions that occur as institutional critique has been sort of a larger part of conversations in museums. So she asks these two larger questions. How can artists who have become art historical institutions themselves claim to critique the institution of art? And how then can we imagine much less accomplish a critique of art institutions when museum and market have grown into an all-encompassing apparatus of cultural reification? And you can think about this, and it probably is not something that's unfamiliar to you, is sort of the idea of mega museums, right? How bad things have become in the art world, in which the Museum of Modern Art in New York opens its new temporary exhibition galleries with a corporate collection and an art hedge funds sell shares of single paintings. All of these past ideas of what museums and galleries have now been sort of taken over by mega museums like the Metropolitan or MoMA, and the 24/7 global art markets. How can you deal when there is no longer an outside? And so now, when we need it most, institutional critique is dead and victim of its success or failure, swallowed up by the institutions it stood against. So I always think about Jeff Koons and Damien Hirst as sort of examples of this, as sort of mega artists, right, of the mega museum, where they claim to be critiquing institutions at some level, but their work is very much sort of a commodity made for purchasing by the museum elite. And so is it necessarily, who the hell is it critiquing, right? If they're making millions upon millions of dollars, where does the critique lie? To give the most obvious example, the enormous expansion of museum audiences, celebrated under the banner of populism, has proceeded hand in hand with the continuous rise of entrance fees, excluding more and more low-income visitors, and the creation of new forms of elite participation, with increasingly differentiated hierarchies of membership viewings and galas. Museums have become vehicles for mass marketing of elite tastes and practices that, while perhaps less rarefied in terms of aesthetic competencies they demand, are even more rarefied economically as prices rise, all of which also increases the demand for products and services of art professionals. That the art world, now a global multi-billion-dollar industry, is not part of the real world is one of the most absurd fictions of art discourse. So as these museums and institutions get sort of bigger and bigger and more powerful, you start to sort of wonder who these museums could actually be critiquing, right? When they put on some sort of exhibition where they're like, oh, this is our conference on the critique of institutions, you think this is insane, to the extent that museums sort of press their own dialogues and encourage sort of their own particular ideas. I also think about something that Fraser says, right, which is that increases demand for products and services of art professionals themselves. So like when you think about Hirst and Koons as examples, here you have Hirst producing this, diamond skull out of hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of diamonds, and then Jeff Koons producing these sort of kitsch objects, which are worth millions of dollars as well. Sort of who are those objects for, right? These expensive products made out of expensive materials, who is going to buy that? Not some everyday person on the street. And then when I slipped into here with Blake Lively, you have things like the Met Gala or the Met Ball, annual fundraising to benefit the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Costume Institute, right? This is not everyday people coming to this. It's celebrities. They're in insanely expensive gowns coming to sort of celebrate the Met, but it's not something that's meant for the everyday individual, right? This is an elite event. So Fraser also sort of critiques this idea of mega artists and mega museums sort of adopting these phrases that have been used by artists. So the critique of institutions becoming this sort of institutional critique concept. So not a phrase used intentionally at first, but was used by artists critiquing institutions, for which Andrea Fraser is ashamed because she in part helped to sort of make this phrase popular. You have the reduction of certain radical practices to a pithy catchphrase. So what Fraser sort of develops at the end of her article, and we start to sort of see her get to, is that art does not exist outside of the museum. There's no outside of the institution. It's just sort of about what kind of institution you're talking about, what kind of critique or protest you make, and making sure that you understand sort of where you go from here as you sort of critique and protest particular ideas. So, however, the idea that institutional critique opposes art to institution or supposes that radical artistic practices can and ever did exist outside of the institution of art before being institutionalized by museums is contradicted at every turn by authors and artists and practitioners of that time. They rigorously cite specific interventions developed as a means not only to reflect on these and other institutional conditions, but to also resist the very forms of appropriation on which they reflect. And these artists that she's talking about that kind of developed this idea of institutional critique, like Brud Thayer's here, he's very popular because, and interesting as a part of institutional critique, because in 1968 he announces that he's no longer an artist and appointed himself as director of his own museum, which is the Muséum des Arts Modernes. He started hiring craftspeople to make objects, and he even sort of, in the end, put his museum fiction up for reasons of bankruptcy. So he made this fake museum that didn't sort of exist in any sort of functional, concrete way, but instead made a critique of the apparatus that distributes, presents, and collects art has been inseparable from a critique of artistic practice itself. So he even sort of created a fake location for his museum as well on a beach in Belgium. Dana Buren also, this is where she comes back to Buren, which I like, in which she says, there's this point, right, where it may not have been lost on other artists in the 6th Guggenheim International Exhibition, since it was they, not museum officials or trustees, who demanded the removal of Buren's work in 1971. So coming back to this work, she says that in actuality, you have to think about that, yes, while Buren was kind of censored in some way by the Guggenheim, it wasn't actually the Guggenheim's fault necessarily, because here they were, the artists, who are also part of the institution, demanding the removal of this work. So Fraser kind of reiterates that, yes, although you could blame the Guggenheim for what has occurred, it was also the artists demanding this action. The Guggenheim had intended to keep it up. So Hans Hock, who's a very famous artist in this movement as well, says artists, as much as their supporters and their enemies, no matter of what ideological coloration, are unwitting partners. They participate jointly in the maintenance and or development of the ideological makeup of their society. They work within that frame, set that frame, and are being framed. And Fraser talks about how Hans Hock is really kind of one of the beginners of institutional critique. And he's playing with a lot of these concepts, but he knows that he is part of the institution and does his work to sort of critique within that frame. And so she talks about works like Condensation Cube by him, in which he created this glass box, and a small amount of water is put in the box, and the box condensates depending on the light and temperature. And it only really occurs with the interaction of the viewer. So something that's not really necessarily bought and sold by the museum in a lot of ways, because it's not really, it's literally just a box with water in it. So it's really about the interaction of the audience and the critique of the making of art objects that he is engaging in. Others are a little more obvious in the way that he's critiquing institutions at large. And this comes back to the quote about him being mad. Mobile Pole from 1970 is a very important work by him, in which he took a actual poll in the museum of the visitors who said, would the fact that Governor Rockefeller has not announced President Nixon's Indochina policy be a reason for you not to vote for him in November? So Hock is questioning a major donor to MoMA, Governor Rockefeller, and his involvement in the Vietnam War, and asking if they find that sort of particularly interesting and revolutionary, and that Rockefeller has a big place in participating money to the MoMA space, which is where this piece was created. And what they found was that twice as many votes for yes as for no. And so Hawke engaged in the institution as a network and social economic relationships, making visible the complicities among the apparently opposed spheres of art, the state, and corporations. And he's been a big figure as his work has been sort of vandalized and censored. And so as he tries to sort of critique museums sort of in their face, he's been sort of censored by them as well. Other works like Sapolsky et al., Manhattan Real Estate Holdings, A Real-Time Social System, as of May 1st, 1971, took on real estate holdings of New York City's biggest slumlords and took sort of meticulous documentation and photographs, questioning the transactions of Harry Sapolsky. And he was sort of, oh, this is a blurry picture, hold on. So he recorded all this information of the poor conditions of these buildings underneath each one of these buildings and recorded it. And it was actually that Sapolsky was friends with some of these individuals that were part of the museum at the time. And so they tried to censor his work as well. But again, calling out, sort of using art to critique social systems, and people have power in New York to sort of use and misuse that power to control sort of poor people who can't afford a better apartment in New York City. So he's critiquing them as well. Fraser talks about Michael Asher as well as a big proponent of institutional critique, and what is really important and valuable of his work that sets him apart from someone like Hans Hawke is that his work like Caravan here did not exist within a museum space. So what he did was you had to go to the museum to find out where the caravan was, but where the caravans were actually located or set during that time and place, it was not described as art. So he would put this caravan in different areas, and you could go to the museum to find out where they were located, but in the places that they were, it didn't tell you that this was a piece of art, right? This just looks like an everyday trailer sort of parked. So what Asher was able to do is play with sort of the space of art and art institutions. So to a casual passerby, it was nothing but a caravan. But in the context of a museum, it's reframed as art and as the physical making of art, right? So you could see he was sort of documented here. So it really comes back to this idea that Fraser states in the slide from a couple slides ago, which is that a lot of these museums want to pretend like institutional critique, that artistic practice can and ever did exist outside of the institution of art, which is not true. And so what Fraser says is all of these museums kind of try to pretend that you can make a solid critique of institutions without sort of being part of institutions, or whatever sort of argument you want to make. Any art, once called art, is already part of the institution. And however, it was Asher who may have realized with the greatest precision Barron's early understanding that even the concept, as soon as announced, and especially when it is exhibited as art, becomes an ideal object which brings us once again to art. So no matter what, once a piece of art is considered art, it is now an art object and thus part of the institution. There's no separation. And Burren talks about this in his Function of the Museum and Function of the Studio. Museum makes its mark, imposes its frame on everything that is exhibited in it in a deep and indelible way. It does so easily because everything that a museum shows is only considered produced in view of being set in it. Analysis of the art system must inevitably be carried on by investigating both the studio and the museum as customs and the ossifying customs of art. So even as an artist creates an object in their studio, that studio is an institution and part of that space as it is created into art. So she critiques sort of flyers, state that institutional critique is art that exposes the structures and logics of museums and art galleries, reflecting, revealing, subverting, and sabotaging. In either case, art and artists generally figure as antagonistically opposed to an institution that incorporates, co-opts, commodifies, and otherwise misappropriates once radical and uninstitutionalized practices. The entire field of art is a social universe. So every single thing that is part of the art world is already part of it because it is, right? You have museums and galleries, corporate office, collectors' homes, public space. She goes on to list everything, right? Produce studios, art magazines, catalogs, classes in colleges, art columns, right? So there is, of course, an outside of the institution, but it has no fixed substantive characteristics. It is only what, at any given moment, does not exist as an object of artistic discourses and practices. So let's say you're talking about your pen, right? I'm holding my pen with my notes. This pen is not an object of art until I start discussing it as an object of art, and now it is. Now it's part of that discussion. But just as art cannot exist outside the field of art, at least not as artists, critics, curators, etc., and what we do outside of the field, to the extent that it remains outside, can have no effect within it. And sort of the solidifying part of that, which is we are the institution. It is because the institution is inside of us and we cannot get outside of ourselves. It is not a question of being against the institution. We are the institution. It's a question of what kind of institution we are, what kind of values we institutionalize, what forms of practice we reward, and what kind of rewards we aspire to. Every time we speak of the institution as other than us, we disavow our role in the creation and perpetuation of its conditions. We avoid responsibility for or action against the everyday complicities, compromises, and censorship, above all self-censorship, which are driven by our own interests in the field and the benefits we derive from it. So Fraser talks about Dadaism as a part of this, mostly because when you think about art and the avant-garde, really Marcel Duchamp changed the way that people thought about the art object. So you have Dadaism no longer criticize schools that preceded it, but criticizes art as an institution and the course its development took in bourgeoisie society. Declare that everything and anything could be art. So what he actually did, instead of sort of critiquing art institutions as a whole, what ends up happening is Duchamp's work affirmed the omnipotence of artistic gaze and its limitless incorporative power. It opened the way for the artistic conceptualization and commodification of everything. That artist certainly does not denounce the art market, but adapts to it. And the reason is the failure of the avant-garde. If Duchamp's intention was to make everything art so nothing was art, what he did, in fact, was to bring everything into the art world and made everything sort of commodifiable. It is artists, as much as museums or the market, who, in their very efforts to escape the institution of art, have driven its expansion. Every day, people work in the real world. We expand our frame and bring more of the world into it, but we never escape it. And I think it's kind of really powerful that she says sort of, do we consider that kind of the failure of avant-garde, right? Did it fail to sort of do its purpose? And I don't know. I don't know if it failed or that we're failing now. It's sort of hard to know. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples here quick and also talk about Andrea Fraser's work a little bit as well. To sort of give you an idea of how artists are kind of engaging this, other than sort of some white males generally. So obviously the Guerrilla Girls are a big part of the critique of institutions at large, as their work critiques museums and shows that they put on, and how much sort of women participate in them. And so they are a big part of institutional critique. And a lot of critics sort of talk about this quote unquote selling out, because even within They came to be in 1985. A year after that, they were already popular in museums. And so they were able to sort of quote unquote critique the museum on their walls. But what you see is that their critique of institutions never lived outside of the institution, so it didn't matter, right? It doesn't really matter if they're inside the museum or outside. They're still able to critique that space. Andrea Fraser's work is pretty crazy and weird at large. I would definitely, so this is the only video I would really suggest watching that I'm going to post, is of her work, Little Frank and His Cart from 2001. In this work, she walks around the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, listening to the official audio guide, and then she starts sort of having this sexual interaction with the museum itself after it tells her to have a connection with the physical space. And so she's kind of following the directions of a real audio guide from the museum, and sort of having this very visceral interaction with the physical body of the Guggenheim itself. It's very weird and comedic to watch. Other works by her include Museum Highlights, a gallery talk from 2006, in which she pretended to be a fictional person, a docent named Jane Castleton. She enacts with the space, where she goes around and highlights different gender and class relations. She leads real tours around the museum, and exaggerated praise of all these different people. She would make them go into restrooms and museum stores and the cafeteria. But she also very much spent time critiquing corporate and private censorship, and perceptions of relationships with museums, as well as saying sort of weird, vague things like, this picture is a brilliant example of a brilliant school, which is definitely something you could see a docent saying. But she says that the viewers will have to improve their taste if they are to agree that great art is better than what we've been purchasing, and sort of critiqued the gallery, and made the visitors sort of think about what they were looking at. Fraser does not critique just the institution of the museum. By extension, she also analyzes the type of viewer the museum produces and the process of identification that artists embody. I will post that video as well if you want to watch her talk a little bit about museums, teach you about museum spaces. Another work by hers that's really revolutionary and insane that she did in 2003 was that she approached a gallery about a commission for a sexual encounter between her and a collector, and then she recorded a taping of this that was produced in editions of 5, and the collector paid $20,000 to be a part of this work, and then an hour-long video that was played in the gallery space of them having sex, and she really changes the idea of what an institution is with this. And I have this quote from her here. Fraser, defending her work in an interview with the Brooklyn Rail, said, "Well, yes, it's art, and the question I'm interested in posing is whether art is prostitution, in a metaphorical sense, of course. Is it any more prostitution because I happen to be having sex with a man that it would be if I were just selling him a piece?" And as controversial or provocative as entitled may be, framing the exchanges made within the art world and showing how art has become a commodity, Fraser again expertly executes her critique over the art world and players within it, herself included. So she's selling herself sort of as a object, right? As a sort of physical form of her art, in literally having sex with a collector, which is crazy. But also revolutionary in a lot of ways, for an artist. I have another work. I'm going to list the wall label here, on the page for the class as well, with Open Space from 2016, in which you hear you have this empty space where you hear sounds of birds, squeaks like sneakers on a gym floor, rumbling of voices, hiss of the shower turning on, keys rattling, clanging, people yelling, etc. And it's this recording she made called Down to the River, or down the river, I'm sorry, produced after 1 day of recording in Sing Sing's prison A block. She wasn't allowed to visit, but she asked guards about the sounds that were most represented in the Sing Sing environment and produced a 55-minute loop that fills the empty floor of the Whitney Museum's 5th floor. So you can think about critiquing not institutions themselves, but maybe other institutions, sorry, not museum institutions, but other institutions like prison systems. Fred Wilson, Minding the Museum, is also another really revolutionary work from 92 to 93. He goes to the Maryland Historical Society and creates this exhibition. He finds that when he visited the museum, he had a kind of visceral response. He felt uncomfortable there. And he decided to engage with the museum and create this exhibition in which he reframed objects in their collection. The museum sort of struggled with it at first, but their exhibition was so popular that they realized sort of that they had to change, that their sort of objects that they had on file, or objects that they were displaying and the way they were displaying them, encouraged sort of racist ideas about Maryland, and they really needed to rethink their collection as a whole. And so he reinstalled these objects to question museum biases and misrepresentations of history. And a lot of these things were left up to interpretation, and by not presenting sort of any particular ways to be view or contemplate them. So you had things like metalwork, in which he showed these ornate silverware accompanied by shackles, sort of accompanying the lavish lifestyle of slave owners with the objects of slavery. He displayed cigar Indians facing a wall with every single person who commissioned those works, and why they sort of wanted to commission them for commercial purposes, which were quite racist in a lot of ways. We have his display of busts. On the right, there is Napoleon, Andrew Jackson, and Henry Clay against 3 others, which are of Black figures, Frederick Douglass, Benjamin Banneker, and Harriet Tubman. And of course, obviously, you can see there is nobody there. And so contradicting the idea of sort of classical bust making with race and the issue that there aren't portraits of these other figures, including a globe that says truth on it. You have other displays here like antique chairs gathered around a whipping post that they had ownership of. He displayed a 9-foot-long punt gun that was used in the 19th century by Chesapeake Bay hunters to hunt game birds, along with images for fugitive slave reward posters. He also had these objects of transportation, one of them being the baby carriage here, which displayed a Ku Klux Klan robe folded carefully into a diminutive stroller. The robe proved to be a haunting detail, suggesting racism is learned and even nurtured. And he would accompany objects like this with images of Black nannies taking care of white children. And other images like this detail from Justice Engelhart Kuhn's Henry Darnell III, Minding the Museum, in which you have this young boy whose portrait has been taken on the right, with another boy here on the left who has a metal collar. And the figure has gone unmentioned by the museum's collection for some time. And now, because of the exhibition, the museum references directly the figure, which states, depicted Darnell with his slave. This may be the earliest portrait of an American slave that survives. Wilson was not super thrilled with this new way that they were engaging with this portrait, but happy that it's part of the dialogue, I suppose. a very small step, theoretically. But Fred Wilson did this great work, and it really made the Maryland Historical Society rethink how they collected objects. And obviously you can see they have sort of all these objects of slavery, and how are they sort of combining them to think about them in sort of conjunction with other objects that they own. The other one that I wanted to put in here quickly is the protest of the Sackler family at the Guggenheim Museum in New York in March 2019. This was a really big deal last year, if you guys saw it. I have talked about it before, but the Sackler family has given a lot of money to the art community, having many galleries named after them. And in 2019, there was a massive protest at the Guggenheim where prescription scripts and flyers were dumped off of the many levels. Because the Sackler family has made around $13 billion through their company Purdue Pharma, who are the inventors of OxyContin, which is one of the main sources of the opioid crisis. And so figures have come out to protest them and their integration in the art community as well. Even figures like Nan Goldin, who I have on both slides here, who is a very famous activist for the AIDS crisis, also being part of this as well. And so you can see that, like in the Louvre here, and in other galleries, they have Sackler wings, as the Sackler family has donated to these spaces. And this family has come under fire quite recently because of the way that they have pushed OxyContin on people and sort of encouraged this opioid crisis by making it easily accessible, and even promoting it for smaller pain issues. And so they've had to pay for this sort of false advertising that they've done. And so people have come out to protest sort of the use of power and money that the Sackler family has done, and then giving that money to museum cultures. So they not only dump posters, but fake prescription bottles, as well as these sort of fake prescriptions. And it actually has caused sort of fundamental change in that the Sackler family's names have been started to be removed from museums. So the Louvre has taken the Sackler family down. So it's been removed from their wall labels. So in critiquing their sort of interaction with art museums, they're also critiquing sort of their place in the opioid crisis and sort of the issues that they've caused at large in society. So sort of two different versions of the institution. So just remember that critique of institutions can go beyond the study of museums, galleries, and art, but into the ideas of institutions as a whole. So this will be important for us as we start to engage with the idea of postmodern Blackness, and really kind of engage with Black Lives Matter protests as well. So I will talk to you guys all next week. Email me with questions or concerns.